right. Well, welcome everyone. Thank you for taking the time to attend this webinar on the U.S. budget and advocacy for nuclear threat reduction. This webinar is hosted by the Physicists Coalition for Nuclear Threat Reduction. My name is Rostampour, and I'm the coalition's policy and communications coordinator. To give you some background on the event's organizer, the coalition was founded in 2019 with a grant from the American Physical Society's Innovation Fund and worked with support from the APS and the Carnegie Corporation until October 2022. After completing its initial startup phase, the coalition has been working in partnership with the Arms Control Association. Together, we work to raise awareness about the threats of nuclear weapons within the physical science communities and aim to reduce the threat by mobilizing advocacy within those communities. In today's webinar, we want to focus on the U.S. budget for nuclear weapons for the fiscal year 2024, what it entails and how it compares to last year. We also want to discuss a nuclear weapon program not included in the president's budget request, namely a nuclear-capable sea-launched cruise missile that some in Congress are pushing for. Quickly on the logistical side of things, we have two speakers, two stellar panelists today presenting on these topics and taking your questions. Each of them will have about 10 to 12 minutes. After both have spoken, we will have a Q&A with the audience. At any point during the remarks, if you have a question for them, please send it through the Q&A function, for which there's a button at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I will sort through those questions and pose them to the speakers. So on that note, please join me in welcoming our two wonderful panelists today. So we have with us Shannon Bugos, who's going to be our first speaker, who's a senior policy analyst at the coalition's partner organization, the Arms Control Association. At the ACA, Shannon contributes research and analysis, reports for the organization's journal Arms Control Today, and creates and updates Arms Control Association's online resources. Shannon is currently writing about the U.S. national security budget for the fiscal year 2024 for this journal, among a lot of other research projects that she has. Our second speaker is Hans Kristensen, who is the director of the Nuclear Information Project at the Federation of American Scientists, a nonprofit organization founded in 1946 by scientists who worked on the Manhattan Project to develop the first atomic bombs. He is a co-author of the Nuclear Notebook column in the Bulletin of the Atomic Scientist, the World Nuclear Forces chapter in the Stockholm International Peace Research Institute's yearbook, and the Nuclear Weapons Ban Monitor. Hans is a frequent consultant to the news media on the status and role of nuclear weapons. So welcome to both of you. Thank you for joining us. And I'll first hand it over to Shannon Bugos to get us started.
Great, thanks, Chris, and thanks to you and the coalition for having me here. I'm going to share some slides because with the defense budget, there's going to be a fair number of numbers thrown at you. So I figured it will be easier to have it on screen. All right, is that good? Can everyone see? Cool. So as Chris said, my name is Shannon Bugos. I'm a senior policy analyst at the Arms Control Association. My task here is to give an overview of the U.S. nuclear weapons budget for fiscal year 2024. The fiscal year begins in October, and Congress is currently wading through the Biden administration's budget requests for the government. For our purposes, the funding for nuclear weapons programs and activities falls within the Defense and Energy departments. And specifically at the Energy Department, it's a semi-autonomous agency called the National Nuclear Security Administration, or NNSA. In total, so here's when I begin throwing some numbers at you. In total, the Biden administration requested $56.5 billion for nuclear weapons related activities at DoD and NNSA for fiscal year 24. This breaks down to 37.7 billion for DoD and 18.8 billion requests for NNSA. The total number of 56.6 billion marks an 11% increase from the fiscal year 23 request. So the primary things that we, and I am certainly using the royal we here, meaning those in the nuclear arms control and disarmament communities who keep an eye on the budget. So what we are primarily looking at are the nuclear weapon modernization programs and any new nuclear weapon programs. So the Defense Department oversees the nuclear weapon delivery vehicles, which means intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine launched ballistic missiles, and heavy bombers assigned to a nuclear mission. For the land-based leg of the triad, and then the NNSA oversees the nuclear warheads part. So going into the Defense Department specifically, this is a broad overview, this table here. I want to emphasize it is an overview. It's not super detailed, but it will give you a sense for what these nuclear modernization programs are, a quick description, what they're meant to replace, and then what the FY24 request is. So I will not be reading all those numbers out at you. I figure it's easier to see them. So for the land-based, there we go. All right, I swear I'm on the right side now. So for the land-based leg of the triad, the modernization program for the current Minuteman III ICBMs is the Ground-Based Strategic Deterrent Program, also known as Sentinel, and it will feature new ICBMs. For the sea-based leg of the triad, the Pentagon aims to replace the current Ohio-class ballistic missile submarines with the Columbia-class. And for the air-based leg of the triad, the Air Force is working on the new B-21 Raider strategic bomber and the new long-range standoff weapon, an air-launched cruise missile replacement. Much attention right now is focused on a new nuclear weapon delivery capability, which Chris had mentioned at the beginning, which is the sea-launched cruise missile, or SLCM. We always need an acronym in the DC space. So the Biden administration does not plan to pursue this capability, but many members in Congress from both sides of the aisle do want it. Last year, Congress did end up giving money to the SLCM program, even though the administration had requested a total of $0 for it. Hans is going to provide much more detail on the SLCM capability in just a bit, so I'm going to leave that to him and not steal his thunder. So switching then to the NNSA. Here, the NNSA oversees the nuclear warheads themselves. So this includes the nuclear warheads that sit atop missiles and then also their gravity nuclear bombs. So some of the nuclear modernization programs at NNSA include modifying the ICBM warhead for the new Sentinel system, as well as refurbishing the B-61-12 gravity bomb and the warhead for the air-launched cruise missile, so as to extend their respective service lives. There are two NNSA programs that the arms control community has tracked closely. So as you can see in this table here, it is again a broad overview of some of the programs going on at NNSA. And one of the ones, like I said, that people are keeping an eye on is obviously the alteration program for a warhead for the nuclear SLCM. And then the other is centered on the Megaton class B-83 gravity bomb. So this bomb was slated for retirement before the Trump administration endeavored to extend its life and keep it in the arsenal. The Biden administration has planned to go ahead with its retirement, but Congress slowed that plan down a little bit in last year's budget legislation with an amendment. As you can see in the table, there is about 31 million in the FY24 budget request for the B-83. But as I note here, that's for the safe sustainment of the gravity bomb, not necessarily its life extension program. So there is a bit of a difference. Speaking of legislation, when it comes to the specific legislation that includes funding for all of these nuclear weapons activities and programs, we are talking about the National Defense Authorization Act, or the NDAA, the Defense Appropriations Bill, and the Energy and Water Appropriations Bills. Think of the difference between authorization and appropriations as authorization is me telling you that you will have $20 to spend on lunch today, while the appropriation is me actually writing and handing you a check for $20. But this can be somewhat the tricky part, is the authorization amount and the appropriations amount can be different. So if I was in a bad mood, I could tell you, yes, you have $20 to spend on lunch today, but then I might write you a check for only $15. The House and the Senate Armed Services Committees handle the authorization process, while the House and Senate Appropriations Committees handle, you guessed it, the appropriations. So on this next slide, again, this is a broad overview, but we have the White House submitting its formal request. Then it's going to the congressional committees. So as you see here, NDAA, Armed Services Committees, the two different defense and then the energy and water are two different appropriations bills. Those go to the House and Senate Appropriations Committees. All of this legislation does make its way to the House and Senate floor. Often this is only after, for instance, especially on the NDAA side, kind of the House and Senate Armed Services Committee leaders do meet in what's called a conference and have to work out some of the differences between the House and the Senate legislation. But then it hits the floor for a full vote. And then, right now, the congressional committees are still in that kind of that second column, right? So they're taking their turns with the proposals from the Biden administration, but from what we hear in the news and everything, they won't really dig into it until after the debt ceiling issue is resolved. But when it does, the main action is going to be what's called a markup. So essentially, the chairperson of the committee presents a version of the Biden administration's budget request, but with the changes they want to see. This is often referred to as the chairperson's mark. The rest of the committee will, during the markup, get a chance to weigh in and add changes as well. So then after that, it's from the floor, and then if approved by Congress, it goes to the president's desk. Some things to watch out for when the markups do happen is Congress slipping even more money into the budgets than the administration requested, as seen in previous years. In FY23, Congress authorized an additional $45 billion to the Biden administration's overall national defense budget request of $813 billion. Granted, far from all of the additional funds went directly towards the nuclear weapons programs. Congress attributed the increase to addressing inflation, aiding Ukraine, and then as well boosting defense priorities, which does include nuclear modernization. However, this big plus up does go to show how Congress does have the ability to increase funding further. One of the programs to watch in this respect is the nuclear SLCM, where Congress might, just as they did in FY23, give funding where none was requested. Others in the arms control and disarmament community will also be monitoring pretty closely suggested or proposed amendments and amendments designed to undermine nuclear arms control and to lay the groundwork for the Pentagon to increase the size of the US nuclear arsenal. So we saw a hint of this already last week. For instance, Senator Tom Cotton introduced legislation that would require the United States to withdraw from the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or New START, and take steps to potentially increase its nuclear forces. It's likely that that proposed legislation will emerge in some form as an amendment to the NDAA. This would certainly be an amendment that the NGO community would need to rally together to try and defeat. After all, New START is the last remaining nuclear arms control agreement between the United States and Russia, and it is admittedly in a tough spot. However, withdrawing from the treaty will potentially increase instability and worst case scenario assumptions. So I hope this provides a good foundation for where the budget process is right now for fiscal year 24, what the process is, and what are some of the numbers that when we're talking about the nuclear weapons budget, what we really mean by that. And so from here, I'll kick it over to Hans. Thank you for your attention, everyone.
Thank you, Shannon, for that very helpful introduction. Hans, I'll hand it over to you.
Thanks very much. Warn me if you can't hear me or it doesn't move or whatever happens here, but let me just start by saying thanks very much for the invitation. And it's a little odd to be talking about the least noticeable item in terms of budget in the legislation, of course, but it has a lot of implications. And of course, once they get going, you can get really expensive. But the cruise missile is an addition to what Shannon described. The other large part of the modernization program is sort of generally called the program of record. This is a system that was added as a requirement in the Trump administration's nuclear posture review. Before I get into it, I just want to give you a little background here with this slide and remind you that the United States used to have vast numbers of non-strategic nuclear weapons in its arsenal. They were meant for everything from warfare on the ground, shooting up submarines at sea, anti-air. They even had a nuclear bazooka and a nuclear torpedo. I mean, you name it, it was all there. It was part of this crazy Cold War that many people probably on this call didn't live through. And so this is an area that the United States military has largely moved away from. During the late 1980s, but certainly during the 1990s, virtually all of the US non-strategic nuclear weapon systems were retired, scrapped. It's not because the US didn't know that the Russians had a lot more non-strategic nuclear systems than the United States, but that didn't matter militarily. Nor was it because the Chinese did not have regional nuclear forces back then. They still do, but that also did not matter for this decision. This happened because they decided that tactical nuclear weapons were not needed and to serve these functions anymore. Advanced conventional weapons could do it, and to the extent that nuclear mattered, that function could be served by long-range strategic systems, either ballistic missiles, but in smaller scenarios, mainly long-range cruise missiles and gravity bombs on strategic and fighter jets. So almost all of this tactical stuff was eliminated. We only have a few hundred tactical nuclear bombs left for fighter jets, about 100 of which are stationed in Europe. That system, that inventory included a nuclear cruise missile. It was called the SLICM-N, or the T-launch, the Tomahawk land attack missile, nuclear armed. And it came out in the early 80s, first on submarines, and then on a vast number of surface ships. And you can see initially it was a large inventory of over 750 missiles for nearly 200 ships and submarines. I mean, welcome to the Cold War. Eventually, like it often happens, a lot of that did not materialize. Far fewer missiles were produced and fielded before fewer ships and submarines. But it was a unique and very capable systems for its time, a range of about 2,500 kilometers. So you could shoot these things in from all sorts of angles, from a wide range of platforms, and a broad range of yield going from 5 up to 150 kiloton. Very flexible weapon system, and the Russians hated it. It was very difficult to plan against. It was offloaded from the fleet when the Cold War ended, and actually these systems never came back. They never went back out to sea again. And then, of course, the surface fleet was denuclearized by the Clinton administration's nuclear posture in 1994. But it did keep a sort of a reload capacity for the submarines, or capability for the submarines. But it was never exercised, in terms of putting, nuclear cruise missiles out there. And then by the early 2000s, there were only about 260 left of these for about a dozen subs that the Navy bothered put through this requirement. And then it was retired by the Obama administration's nuclear posture review in 2010. And we can see from documents we received on the Freedom of Information Act that all W80 warheads for this system were dismantled by 2012. So it's gone. There's no way to sort of reconstitute it unless you build something new. Lord and behold, that is what the Trump administration came up with. Not so much that I think you could say sort of it was the Trump administration that came up with a bright new idea. They'd been pushed for more nuclear weapons for a while from a variety of pro-nuclear corners. And they sort of tried different things, but the political winds changed in the Trump administration. It was susceptible to these kinds of ideas. So they proposed a couple of these with low yield capabilities. That's how it was sold at the time. This was a necessary thing to respond to Russia's nuclear sable rattling and also what's happening in the Pacific. So they came up with all sorts of ideas for why this was necessary suddenly after the military has been planning for decades not to have it. So, you know, some of these arguments worked at the time, some did not, but the Trump administration started the program. And so you can see some of the arguments that are used here. I call them poor justifications because, you know, there's no evidence that the adversaries are sitting out there looking at the US arsenal and saying, aha, they don't have a low yield nuclear sea-launched cruise missile. Now is our chance. Let's go attack. You know, it doesn't work like that. There are plenty of low yield capabilities in the US stockpile, including air-launched cruise missiles, and there will continue to be so for the foreseeable future. So advocates have a hard time arguing or showing why this would be uniquely required in addition to these capabilities. We can go into some of these details. The Biden administration's nuclear posture review canceled those plans from the Trump administration because it said, well, we already got the W76-2, which is a low-yield warhead that was fielded for the Trident ballistic missile submarine fleet. That was also a Trump administration idea. So now we have that, so why do you need something else? There's doubt, they said, about what kind of leverage this would give us over Russia, you know, both in terms of mission and messaging. And then there are the expected cost. It would have to compete with both cost, but also scheduling in a very, very busy nuclear modernization program. So what are really the advantages that we get out of this? That didn't deter the commander of U.S. Strategic Command and several pro-nuclear people. They continued to rally in the public in favor of this weapon system. It's stepping back. It is astounding that this country had a commander of U.S. Strategic Command publicly arguing in contradiction of the administration's nuclear posture review. But that's how ingrained the nuclear sort of priesthood, if you will, really is. And so they were pushing their entire own agenda here. And in these arguments, some of them early on didn't quite work. So now we're sort of in the spaghetti argument mode here, where people throw arguments or justification against the wall and see what sticks. And those arguments that sort of stick or are not shut down, we can use them later, so to speak. And one, of course, is to deter low threshold nuclear use. This is this idea that the Russia would respond to with tactical nuclear weapons. If it was using a conventional aggression, things were going wrong in that sense. There's no evidence at all to suggest that this is how the Russians would react or others. Also, this claim that the US only has disproportionate unusable response options. This means that if the Russians or someone else used low-yield tactical weapons, the United States would be lost. We would have nothing to respond with. And it's complete ridiculous because, you know, we have a large inventory of air-launched cruise missiles, gravity bombs, whether they be delivered by fighter jets or strategic bombers, including stealth bombers, that have low-yield options in them. By my count, we have sort of upward to around just under 1,000 warheads with those options in them today. But somehow adversaries just don't know about that or don't care about, but if we get a low yield slickum, hallelujah, we're saved. So it's kind of sort of an odd type of arguments games that's going on. Another version was he wanted to have something that they could respond with but without visible generation. This means you could have it out there. It is already loaded on the subs. It's lurking off the coast. The adversaries don't know exactly where it is. And this thing can fire without any signs that it's preparing to do so. So this is sort of, a surprise attack kind of capability. An amazing argument or amazing claim that this is necessary to deter an adversary these days, despite what the Russians and the Chinese are doing. And then, of course, this idea of a persistent, survivable regional capability. We have persistent, survivable regional capabilities. That's how we have planned our nuclear force posture for the last 3 decades. The features will be, they're still being worked out, but as far as we can see, we will have a new missile. It's a little unclear exactly how new, whether it is an entirely new missile or a version of an existing or heavily modified system. We will still have to see how that pans out if they move forward with this. Then the warhead that will go on that cruise missile is an alteration of the warhead that is being built or modified for the new air-launched cruise missile. So it's not like they would have to build an entirely new warhead. It would most likely have about the same range of yield, but potentially with more options to give it more flexibility to the warfighter. And it would go on the attack submarines. Pictured here is the Virginia-class submarine that is also being upgraded. So that's sort of the idea here. Finally, before I end, something about the challenges. Well, like I mentioned, there is the cost and the production schedule. The nuclear establishment, the production establishment, the enterprise is very, very overloaded with all the other modernization programs that are underway that are compressed into a short period of time. Not a whole lot for slipping schedules and what have you and adding new capabilities. There are only so many facilities that can produce these things. So this is one real challenge for it. The other is for the submarine mission itself. The U.S. attack submarines got rid of the nuclear missions, and the submarine community loved that because then they could focus on the non-nuclear mission. They were not tied down in nuclear scenarios. They didn't have to waste personnel or onboard equipment or long training sessions and to be proficient in launching nuclear weapons. That would all have to return to the submarine fleet if they got this weapon again. So, you can find people who publicly will stand up and say, oh yeah, we think this is important. But privately, I think people are very clear that this would be a distraction from the submarine mission. It would also be a violation of the US presidential nuclear initiative that was issued in 1992. In that initiative, the United States promised that it would not produce new nuclear sea-launched cruise missiles. So that would be a violation of that pledge back then. It would also raise this irritant in US diplomatic relations of nuclear-capable ship port visits. This was a big issue during the Cold War, where the United States tried to maintain good relations with allies around the world and partners and others, but many of them had policies that did not allow nuclear weapons on their territory. But the US insisted that it didn't want to say whether its ships or submarine carried nuclear weapons. This turned into big diplomatic fights and constant irritations around the world that actually gave momentum and a lot of fuel to anti-American local sentiments and groups in those countries. Is this really what they want to reinstate? We've just a few days ago here had an incident from Iceland, which after many years of objecting to nuclear-powered attack submarines visiting their ports, finally said, we think we will allow this now. However, they said, those ships cannot carry nuclear weapons. So they're already putting their marker out there saying this. The one thing that could disrupt this in the future would be if somebody in the United States managed to convince the next administration to put nuclear cruise missiles out on these submarines. To get what in return? So I think overall, this is a stupid idea, full of counterproductive issues that doesn't give us anything distinctive or unique in response to the capabilities we already have in the existing arsenal. So I'll stop with that and hand it over.
Thank you so much, Hans, and Shannon, again, for your wonderful presentations. If anyone has any questions for our panelists here, again, you can use the Q&A function at the bottom of your Zoom screen. I'll wait for a bit to see if any questions arise. If not, I do have some questions myself. All right, I'll start off with a question for you, Hans. You mentioned a lot of challenges with the development of this new weapons system. I've also read articles about the Navy being reluctant to host this program. Can you talk a little bit about that and why the Navy doesn't want this program?
Yes. So when they retired or considered retiring the old nuclear sea-launched cruise missile, it went through a number of phases, and the Navy actually advocated for scrapping the old cruise missile many years before the White House finally agreed that that was a good idea to do. So it sort of hung on there for a while, entirely for political reasons, not for the Navy sort of wish list. Here we are again, after, consider that the attack submarine fleet now, the theme is that we have too few attack submarines. They have too much to do. The Chinese are coming, the Russians are coming, all this kind of stuff. Why on earth would anybody propose to put a nuclear cruise missile mission on those submarines? It is a distraction from the mission. It's not just sort of roll a nuclear cruise missile down to the submarine. The submarine have to be equipped with the right command and control and launch equipment. The crew has to be trained to be able to do this. They have to go through certifications to meet those standards to be able to launch it. You have to equip land-based facilities to store and service these weapons. And then, of course, the State Department will have to figure out some people working overnight to resolve these diplomatic issues every time a ship with a nuclear submarine capability comes into a foreign port. So for all these reasons, my impression is that the Navy is not happy about getting such a system.
Thank you for that. We have a question from Cheryl Spencer, and this could be for either of the panelists. So the question is, why has Tom Cotton issued that bill, the bill to push for the SLUC amendment? Who is influencing him? What is his district? So
I can go on that one. So I think Cheryl's referring to Senator Cotton's bill that he introduced regarding New START. So Senator Cotton has long been an opponent of arms control. And so he also sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee. So seeing this proposed bill pop up was not entirely a surprise given his track record when it comes to nuclear issues and arms control. And so that's why, especially since he sits on the Senate Armed Services Committee, an amendment might pop up in that regard. That's basically a variation of the bill. And I'm happy to put the text of the bill in the chat so that people can see more details about it. There are a number of other Republican senators who had signed on as well. And as I said at the top, unfortunately, this was not entirely unexpected, but it will be very important now that it's been introduced as a bill and potentially when it's seen as an amendment to work hard to defeat it.
thank you for that, Shannon. We have another question, and I'll give a little bit of context. So as many of you know, the coalition has been trying to advocate against this type of weapon system or in general, new weapon systems addition to the US nuclear arsenal. So this question asks, could you give us a sense of pro-nuclear arms lobbying efforts with regards to the US defense budget. Who are we up against? How much do they spend? And what kind of methods do they use? So Hans or Shannon, if either of you want to answer that.
I can start, and Hans, if you have anything to add, but my simple answer when it comes to these is usually we're up against the defense industry. And so, for instance, the fight against the ground-based strategic deterrent, the ICBM, the replacement system for the Minuteman III ICBMs, that fight was in a way over long before the arms control community really got engaged, because the companies start getting the people in place, they start setting up a headquarters fairly early on. And so it gets harder and harder given the money and the foundations that are already in place oftentimes when it becomes something that the arms control community can really focus on when it comes to the defense budget. But Hans, anything to add? And I guess real quick, this occurred to me as I was going to hand it off to you, is that Bill Hartung, who's over at the Quincy Institute, he tracks a lot of this, what the defense industry is doing, very, very closely. So I would always recommend looking at his work too.
Yeah, for the bit about a cruise missile, it's a little different because, it's not a system that has a lot of sort of, representations in the states. There's not a lot of political oomph behind it and interest locally. There's so much stuff going on with production conventional cruise missiles in those states that this one system is not going to make a whole lot of difference. So I think there's less momentum. But as you could see, we saw, the former commander of U.S. Strategic Command being very vocal about it. We've seen former defense hawks that are, very busy in the corridors arguing for new systems and have always been. They've been arguing for this one as well. There are also people trying to tie it more into what the allies think, sort of saying, I've been to Europe and in Asia, and I've talked to our allies, and they're really concerned if we don't get this kind of weapon. Oh, I'm sorry, I can't tell you who I talked to, but that's how they feel. I mean, we hear this argument again and again. So, these kind of battles play out. I just want to say that I think it's interesting to see the new commander of U.S. Strategic Command. We'll see how he falls on this issue. He was certainly prodded by Cotton and others during the hearing in Congress to please say that you like and want the cruise missile, but he didn't go there. He sort of said, well, it's an important issue, we have to study it and la-di-da. So he came out less vocal immediately than Admiral Richards certainly had been.
Thank you. We have another question, and this one you have addressed briefly when you mentioned port visits. This one asked, the states who have ratified the TPNW, the Treaty on the Prohibition of Nuclear Weapons, will not allow nuclear armed subs to visit. Given that a large number of countries restrict the subs movements. So the question is, do we need to get more countries to ratify the TPNW?
Yeah, that would help. And those that are signing up, of course, are doing partly so because they've gotten frustrated about the lack of progress. But of course, it's hard to make progress when the nuclear armed states don't want to participate and their allies don't want to participate. So there is, signing up is one option, but you also have to remember there are a lot of countries who already have policies, national policies, where they just do not allow nuclear weapons to come in. And Iceland, that I mentioned, is one. We are just getting two new members into the NATO alliance. Finland has already entered, and Sweden is about to enter, probably. Both of those countries have stated in the past that they do not want nuclear weapons on their territory in peacetime. So, there are a bunch of countries that have these policies. Norway is another one. Attack submarines go and visit Norwegian ports a lot. And in the future, that would be a contentious political issue if they introduce nuclear cruise missiles on those submarines.
Thank you for that. Wait for other questions. In the meantime, I have another question, which again was addressed briefly. So one of the arguments for the nuclear SLECM is that it provides leverage for limited nuclear use against any adversary. So I wanted both of you to talk about that a little bit. Is there anything as a limited nuclear exchange or a limited nuclear war that doesn't escalate?
Well, there are many views on how likely it is or not that something would escalate. We can have that debate. But I think the issue here is more, does the United States currently have in its arsenal sufficient capabilities to serve such a role? And they do. It's not like, we have air-launched cruise missiles being launched from bombers, currently B-52s. They can fly up and down the coast, out of range of any air defense systems or what have you, and pop cruise missiles in there. We also have fighter jets, of course, that can be equipped with nuclear gravity bombs. The new B-21 bomber that's going to come in, stealth bomber, will also have cruise missile launching capability. And that air-launched cruise missile will essentially be able to do the same as the sea-launched cruise missile being proposed for the attack submarine fleet. But the question is then, does it matter? Is it essential? And I have yet to hear people articulating why it is essential. I have never heard an example of a scenario in which we would lose. The adversary would win if we could not launch or have the capability to launch a sea-launched nuclear cruise missile.
I don't have much to add to Hans's answer. I would just say that argument we had seen a lot, obviously, a few years ago with the W76-2 warhead, which was a low yield warhead for Trident SLBMs. And from the policy perspective, a lot of that conversation focused on your question, Chris, right? Of can the W76-2 warhead be used and there not be escalation to the highest nuclear level, right? And I know in the arms control disarmament community, the answer tends to be towards it would be very difficult to see a scenario in which nuclear retaliation is not used, even if something has a smaller yield, simply because I think it's important to remember that the W76-2, and Hans, correct me, but it's roughly the size of the bomb that was dropped on Hiroshima in 1945. So the low yield is still pretty darn destructive. And so when it's the policy language and things like that, it's important to really remember what the battlefield effects of these weapons are.
Yeah, if I could just add, I'll say this notion about limited, it's not about the yield, it is about how intensive your attack is. And so that can be about numbers, but it can also be about yield. But there's this great misunderstanding that people think that if something is a tactical nuclear weapons, then they have very low yields. If something is strategic, they only have very high yield. In fact, the arsenal is a mix of capabilities. There are some strategic that have low yield options, and there are some tactical that have high yield options. So this is sort of people always paint this as in a very black and white, way, because that's an easy way to win a simple argument.
Great, thank you to both of you. We have one more question. This one is from Professor Frank von Hippel, one of the coalition's founders. And the question is, are there objections from the home ports, such as Guam, San Diego, New London, etc., to the attack submarines being equipped with nuclear armed cruise missiles? Have there been reports of any of them objecting to that?
Yeah, that's one of the first questions. I haven't seen that. It's too soon. I remember back in the old days when there were tactical nuclear weapons that were stored in locations like that, There was always local opposition to this. I'm not saying that the local opposition won or something like that, but it always generated local opposition, whether it was in Hawaii, in San Diego, on the East Coast, what have you. And there's no doubt, there's no reason to believe that some of that dynamic would not come back if you try to reintroduce this stuff. Now, we don't even know where they would store them yet in the future. I mean, it could be, of course, that if they came in with a cruise missile, it would simply be stored where the long-range Trident missiles are already stored. So Kings Bay in Georgia, or in near Kitsap or Bangor up in Washington State. And so if there are already nuclear weapons there, adding a few more would probably not change it very much, the local sentiments, but you would have to have some kind of local regional support capability for these systems and certify facilities to be able to service them out in Hawaii and in Europe and places like that.
Great. This next question has to do with universities that are involved in the research and design on nuclear delivery vehicles. So the question is, how can we stop the R&D?
So I can start this one, and Cheryl, I think I may probably cite a report that you may know about, but the ICANN report from a few years ago, and we'll put it in the chat, breaks down the number of, or which universities are involved. And I would love to hear ideas on how to stop some of those universities, but it is very difficult. A lot of the money is wrapped up in the Pentagon. There's usually funding, like for hypersonic weapons, for instance, there's a specific account that is money for universities who are helping with hypersonics weapons testing. So wind tunnels like that, such as that. And so it's definitely difficult to figure out what's the best way to potentially at least slow down some of that R&D. And kind of talking to the physicists at those universities is certainly a very, very good way to start.
Hey, so we have one more question from Stephen Schwartz, and also the last question was from Cheryl Spencer. Forgot to mention that. So this one basically asks, first poses the issue that Republicans are constantly asking for more and more money for nuclear weapons without any logical reason behind it. Then there are the Democrats who generally support the status quo, but they also don't generally advocate strongly for lower budgets. So the question here is, and I'm summarizing, how do you suggest encouraging Democrats or anyone in Congress who would oppose more money for nuclear weapons to take stronger stands on these issues?
I can start off by saying that I think the political climate has quite clearly changed, both domestically and internationally. So it is not enough to go up on the Hill and say, to try to find allies who just don't like nuclear weapons, say, please, United States should do something unilaterally. That tends to fall very quickly because they're seen as naive and by some even irresponsible. It's very hard to argue that the United States should take drastic nuclear unilateral reductions when China and Russia are doing what they're doing. I'm not saying there are not areas where it could be done, but it's hard to make that argument. I would recommend giving people on the Hill, try to give them smart arguments that questions the requirement, questions about getting answers about claims for why something is needed. On the cruise missile, when they say that we need to have this capability lurking off a coast somewhere, arm them with questions about, how does that fit into whatever else we have in the arsenal? Why would that be the silver bullet? Give us an example, ask tough questions like that. Infrastructure questions, added cost and to the nuclear modernization program, scheduling challenges, what have you. Foreign, diplomatic issues with port visits. Do we really want to challenge this and help grow anti-nuclear sentiments in allied countries around the world? Really, for what? So you can feed arguments to people on the Hill that enable them to make these kind of intelligent questions that are not just about, the United States should do more in reducing nuclear weapons, but something that challenges the idea that we need more stuff.
I would definitely agree with Hans. And the only bit I would add is, so ACA works a lot with the Nuclear Weapons and Arms Control Working Group in Congress. And what I've learned a lot from in that group is that not always all the information is there among staffers who handle a lot of these issues. And so it comes down to the very basic of educating a lot of the people on the Hill, especially the staffers who do a lot of grunt work on these are the things that you should keep an eye out for. This is why, this is the type of pushback you'll get. This is why, this is what you can respond with. And it's giving them that information because there's kind of, when you're thinking about amendments, for instance, and for arms control, sometimes amendments can be snuck in that on the surface, people, especially if they're the Armed Services Committee, is all right, that doesn't seem too harmful. But then, like, for instance, take the amendment in fiscal year 23 that required that the US cannot deploy fewer than 400 ICBMs. So someone on the Armed Services Committee may be like, oh, well, that's kind of just status quo. So fine, like, why would we fight that one? But if you're looking at it from the arms control perspective, you're like, well, with New Start, I mean, especially looking at that issue probably before Russia's invasion of Ukraine, but when thinking about the future of arms control and New Start, if you want to eventually do disarmament, that type of amendment would make things a little bit more difficult, right? And so a lot of what is necessary in the work that we do at ACA and with the Congressional Working Group is giving this information to staffers so that they're aware of it and so that we hear about it as well, right? So that we know kind of what's being discussed and how we might be able to counteract that.
Great, thank you, Shannon, for that. On that note, I also want to bring to everyone's attention the coalition's digital advocacy for rejecting any proposals to fund the nuclear SLECM. I have dropped the link in the chat where you can connect to your member of Congress and write to them. With that, if there are any final remarks, Hans and Shannon, please let us know.
No, just thank you for having us here. It was great to field a lot of these questions and always happy to talk further on these issues. So if anyone wants to reach out, happy to talk.
Dito that.
Thank you so much again to both of you for joining us today and for this wonderful discussion on the US budget and on the SLECM. Thank you for joining us, everyone, and being with us today, taking this time out of your day. Those of you who aren't members of the Physicists Coalition, I have dropped a link in the chat, and that will sign you up for our listserv, so you will hear more about our other events, including webinars like this, training sessions, and our calls to actions. So again, thank you, and hope that you enjoy the rest of your day.